Let me start with a quote from our own Prime Minister here in Britain. UKIP is a sort of bunch of fruitcakes and loonies and closet racists mostly. That comes from David Cameron, and it was a quote made in April of 2006. Now, some people have described that as inaccurate, some people have described that as unfair, but certainly it's true that at the time he was dismissive of UKIP, and now he's very much had to change his mind. And we're going to look at some of those reasons. There are three key themes to the run-up to the European elections that we're going to explore today in my section of this presentation. The first is what we call the rise of UKIP, a term that is bounded about quite a lot at the moment. Secondly, Britain's membership of the European Union generally and attitudes towards that. And then wider attitudes towards the EU, both in terms of Britain and wider European countries. So let's start with the rise of UKIP, this term that we keep hearing in the media in this country. Here it is. Here's what the rise of UKIP looks like. And if you look at this graph, you'll see the data goes back all the way to April 2004. So it really charts 10 years of progress for the party. A party that was set up originally really as a single-issue party against membership, Britain's membership of the European Union, coming out of the back of the referendum party. You will see from this graph that there has been a rise of UKIP at regular intervals. In fact, back in 2004, and then again midway through the time period, you'll see that there's that jump upwards. Both of those are associated with European elections. It's true that in previous European elections, when they came third and then second, they did experience a boost literally in the weeks beforehand. It was not a long-lasting thing, and it tended to decline immediately. The rise of UKIP that people talk about on this occasion is clearly very different, and we can see that from the latter half of the graph on the right-hand side. You can see how, really, since the general election in this country in 2010, there has been an enormous growth in UKIP's support. This is Westminster voting intention, and if we look at that in more detail, we can see the results from our daily polling surveys that on this occasion have been taken just since the start of 2012. And as you can see, really, if you look at the long-term trends, the trend line is there in black, you will see that we're looking at around about a 10-point gain. That's an enormous benefit for the party over that period of time, and really a remarkable movement from a party that as recently as the London elections put the wrong name on the ballot paper. And so there's no doubt that the rise of UKIP is real, it's sustained, and is different from how we've seen on previous occasions. But of course detractors would point to the following graph, and this is the percentage of Westminster MPs that UKIP has commanded over the time period. It stays at a relatively stable 0%. So that's the Westminster context, but where the rise of UKIP is particularly important and particularly pertinent at the moment is with regards to the European elections. As we can see here, this was the last European election result back in May 2009, and this is our prediction for the upcoming election as it stands at the moment. And we're going to be publishing updates for this next week. But even based on our most recent figures, you can see that again, the rise of UKIP is pronounced and it's significant. A rise from 17% at the last polls to 31% this time. We predict that UKIP will be the largest party in the European Parliament, in the European parliamentary elections. A massive achievement again. What's also interesting about this chart is the score for Liberal Democrats and Greens. 9% for one, 8% for the other. If the Greens overtake the Liberal Democrats and get more votes at the European elections, it will be an enormous defeat for them. And so the two stories going into next week are the rise of UKIP, but also the performance of the Greens relative to the Lib Dems. So what do people who support UKIP look like? Well, this graph breaks down support for UKIP by different groups. And as you can see, there are some groups among which support at the European Parliament election is very popular, others less so. In Scotland, only 13% of people in that region support UKIP at the European elections. That rises to 42% at the other end of the scale among those who voted Conservative in the general election in 2010. So 42% in our polls of those people are now intending to vote UKIP at at the Europeans. Similarly, they appealed to people aged over 60, people in the C2DE social grades, the lower social grades, people from London, people from South, excluding London, and those over 40. They also do slightly better among men, slightly less well among women, slightly less well among people in London. And they do slightly less well among the upper classes. So the idea that UKIP supporters are simply retired colonels sitting in their golf club boring people is massively inaccurate and not borne out by the facts. But one thing that is also not correct is the idea that for UKIP supporters it's all about Europe. When we look at the most important issues facing the country, you can see that among the entire electorate, Europe figures relatively low down. It's very much a third-tier priority. Around 17% of people name it in their top three when asked to name the most important issues facing the country. Way ahead, in contrast to that, is the economy, immigration, these really important issues that people believe the country is facing. Now, what if you look at this question just among UKIP voters? You find that, yes, Europe is more important, and there's no doubt about that, but way out in front is immigration and asylum. 85% of UKIP supporters in our survey say that that is one of their most important issues. And if we compare the two charts, we can see that there's a general similarity with the trends in these areas, with the exception of immigration and Europe. But as I say, though Europe is more important, it is by no means the only game in town. It's immigration and asylum that's important. And indeed, when you look at support for Europe over a much longer period of time, again, now going back to 2004, you see that it fluctuates along the way, and towards the right of the graph, we see the yellow line, which is disapproval of British membership of the EU. We see that climb around the time of the sovereign debt crisis. But generally speaking, it's fluctuating between 50 and 55%. If we compare that with UKIP support on the same graph, you'll see that as UKIP support grows, actually it's not correlating with disapproval of EU membership, and nor is it correlating with the importance of Europe as an issue. So instead, we can see that it's about something else. UKIP support is based far more broadly than simply Euroscepticism. So what is that? Well, I would say it's complicated, but it can be characterised in three ways. UKIP has been extremely good at mopping up what I've called the 3 Ds. Those people who are dissatisfied, those people who are distrusting, and those people who are disapproving. In other words, people who are uncomfortable with the way that politics and really life in general and society in this country exists. They think that the country is changing, firstly in a way that they are not happy with, and secondly in a way that they have not consented to. And so yes, while it may be broadly true to describe them as Eurosceptics, the important part of this is the sceptic bit rather than the European. Let's explore that in more detail. We conducted a survey asking people to say whether they agreed or disagreed with a range of statements. The first we came up with was most British politicians are personally corrupt. And as you can see, 37% of the country generally agrees with that. But a figure that rises to 63, nearly 2/3 of UKIP supporters. They don't believe that politicians are particularly good people. Indeed, they think they're corrupt. They also don't think they can tell the truth. In other words, distrusting. 72%, not a good figure by any means, of the entire country believes that politicians don't tell the truth, but that rises to 95% of UKIP supporters, an enormous majority. And when you move beyond the political sphere, these themes of dissatisfaction, disapproval, and distrust are replicated across a whole host of different measures. We asked, on balance, do you think Britain is a better or a worse place in which you can grow up than it was 30 or 40 years ago? We see that really nostalgia isn't what it used to be. For the entire country, 55% of people think that it's worse today. But that rises to 82%, over 3/4 of respondents for you who support UKIP. And even moving beyond society and politics to really quite isolated issues, we can see that this persists. Last year, we asked people whether they thought the MMR vaccination was safe or not. And we found there were big differences among UKIP supporters compared to the supporters of all other parties. 28% of UKIP supporters thought it was unfair. Thought it was unsafe, compared to 6% of the entire population. And when we asked, is it dangerous? this was the result. 0% of Labour supporters, 0% of Lib Dems, 0% of Conservatives, and 13% of UKIP supporters thought the MMR vaccination was dangerous. A massive distinction between UKIP and the main parties. So what we're really looking at is what I've characterised the rise of these sceptics. And yes, they tend to be Eurosceptics, but the most important bit of that is the sceptic bit. If we look across Germany at the net gain that these sceptic parties have enjoyed in our polling, we can see that in Britain, Germany, France, Denmark, Sweden and Finland, there's been a net move in favour of these sceptical parties, whether it's Alternative for Germany, the National Front in France, the Danish People's Party, the Swedish Democrats, or the Finns Party. In all cases, there's a move. Now, it's true that the move varies from country to country, and in some cases that move is more significant and comes from a much lower base, but the overall theme remains the same. This leads us on to our next topic, membership of the European Union. Now, at this stage, of course, people will say, well, people want a referendum on membership of the European Union, and that is true. The survey last year, although the most recent figures back this up as well, found that around about 6 out of 10 people want a referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. But the thing is, people want a referendum on pretty much anything. And in fact, in this particular instance, we ran a split sample experiment. Half the sample were asked about Britain's membership of the European Union. The other half were asked if they wanted a referendum on Britain's membership of the Eurovision Song Contest. And we found that 32%, so just under a third of British people, wanted a referendum on the Eurovision Song Contest. What's particularly interesting about this for me is the fact that among UKIP supporters, actually more did want a referendum than didn't. So they really don't want to be in Eurovision anymore. So yes, people want a referendum, and how will they vote in that referendum? Well, if you take the simple in-out question, you find that it's pretty even Stevens. Neck and neck at 51%, 49% between in and out. Obviously differences between the parties. 42% Conservatives wish to stay in, perhaps countering the narrative you often hear about them. But 96%, again, overwhelmingly, UKIP supporters wish to withdraw. Perhaps no surprise given their party's position. And across Europe, the pattern is relatively similar. No one country has a majority of people that wish to leave, but in all countries there's a significant proportion of people who do. Germany, France, they've all changed around a lot recently, but the pattern persists. So what about attitudes to Europe generally? Well, why do people feel that they need to leave the European Union? Well, there are good things and bad things about the European Union, and we've explored those. When we asked people what the best things about joining the European Union were, this is what we found. 38% of people felt that free trade was the best thing, and indeed 27 listed it gives people the freedom to move and live in other European countries. That was important for them when given a choice. But importantly, to me, no one particular advantage wins out. There's no very strong thing that everyone, or indeed a significant proportion of people, attach to. Nothing even gets above 40%. What's also interesting to me is that freedom of movement is the second most popular option, but when you ask people what's the worst thing about the European Union, 43% say freedom of movement. So it's the second most popular, it's also the second least popular thing about the European Union, demonstrating that people have, shall we say, a rather complicated view of such things. Again, when it comes to bad things about the European Union, by no means no one thing rides above the others when given a choice and asked to choose 2 or 3. Interference is listed at top. What I think that demonstrates is a failure of Europe's big narratives to engage with its people. In the past, when the European Union was formed, of course, it was formed to bring peace to a continent that has not enjoyed that for centuries. More recently, it's been about freedom of trade, a single common market, or a single European currency and political union. But now I think we have a failure to engage with the electorate of the continent and explain to them what Europe is now about. Indeed, when we ask people, well, do you think your country will be a member of the European Union 20 years from now? We found that in only a few countries did half of people think that they would be a member just 20 years from now, which I would say is a bad reflection of people's long-term view of the institution. 38% of people in Britain agreed with that. And then when we asked why the European Union exists, we did better in that respect from a European point of view, but still, only around half of people could point to the fact that they understood why the European Union exists. Again, a failure of narratives. And perhaps this is linked into it. Does your country get a good deal from being a member of the European Union? In no country does really more than a third of people think that their country gets a good deal. Now, admittedly, the countries that we've polled are the more established, successful economies of Europe, but still a substantial difference. And all things considered, the European Union is a good thing. Again, really, no one getting close to even half of people thinking in their country that the European Union is a good thing. The pattern is replicated when we ask the country would be better off if it were not a member of the European Union. Again, a full range of views, no one view riding out. But perhaps the key result that comes out of these questions is one of reform. When we asked, do you agree that the way the European Union works needs significant reform? Over 2/3 of people in all countries that we tested agreed with that. 69% of people in Britain, 71% of people in Germany believed that there was need for significant reform in the European Union. And actually, when you go further on the referendum question, when you go from what we call the in-out question to what we call the in-out shape it all about question, you find that reform is the most popular option. A plurality of people say they want a less integrated European Union with a number of powers being returned to member states. That was an important difference from the in-out question, but also demonstrates that only around a quarter of people actually want to withdraw completely from the European Union. What they want is reform. Now, of course, that reform can take different forms for different people, but it shows that David Cameron's plan of going to Brussels and coming back with a negotiated resettlement could pay dividends if he can sell it to the people. When you look at withdrawal completely as an option, you can see that with the exception of Ukip, it's by no means an overwhelmingly popular option. Around a quarter of the country overall, and even among Ukip supporters, only around 2/3 actively want withdrawal. And across the rest of Europe, we can see it's a similar pattern. The rise of Ukip is different to the ones that we have seen from previous European elections. It is significant, and it's not just unique to Britain. It's been replicated across the other countries. It's not just about Europe either, it's about more broader scepticism. Many parts of Europe share the same thing, and the EU is failing to win the big narrative battles, with reform being the preferred option at the moment. This will have major implications for the 2015 general election, because how the parties respond to the European elections, particularly Lib Dems potentially losing to the Greens, Ukip potentially finishing with the largest number of votes, the implications for that and how the parties respond are significant. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jane, who will talk about the qualitative work that we've conducted.
Thanks, Joe. Okay. So, to develop some of the work that Joe and his team have been running, we've recently conducted a project looking at these issues in 4 countries across Europe: France, the UK, Sweden and Germany. And the aim of this really is to get under the skin of some of these issues Joe's been talking about, understanding how people feel about Europe, what is it that's motivating their views and opinions, why have we seen some of these feelings coming out around scepticism, and also how they're feeling about the upcoming elections. And we've seen quite big differences in each country in terms of how they feel about next week's elections. So we've talked to 2 of the most sceptical countries, France and the UK, and we've also talked to Sweden and Germany as well. The first question we looked at was really, how European do you think you are? And here we could see some big differences across the countries. In Britain, we found that people really were the least European feeling, and most people that we had in our focus groups identified themselves as being British first and foremost, and sometimes even more local than that, identified themselves as a particular area that they lived in before they would consider themselves to be European. And in France, interestingly, there was a sense that people were struggling to identify as European these days, in the sense that things had changed. So the quote there, Europe as it is now is not united, it's every man for himself, and a sense that their views had changed over time and they were feeling less European than before. But in terms of Sweden and Germany, there were much more sort of positive feelings about feeling European. In Sweden, one of the comments there, I identified myself strongly as European, but I agree that they have more affinity with Northern Europe when it comes to their shared values. And in Germany, being, again, positive about identifying as a person living in Germany, but being happy about the cooperation in Europe on a political level. So then we looked also, interestingly, at how countries are perceiving their role in the EU. And it's interesting to look at what people's perceptions and attitudes are towards this. You can see there on the left-hand side, we have in Britain people thinking of themselves as being a passenger, and that was a word that was used a lot in terms of their feelings about Britain's role within the EU. Perhaps more passive than people would like, and not feeling they have the influence that they should. Other times people talked about Britain as a peacemaker, but certainly feeling that they weren't driving the agenda. In France, what was interesting was that our respondents was fairly pessimistic and were sort of lamenting the changes that they felt with their role in Europe, and feeling that the strong bond they had with the EU was diminishing and that their relationship was weaker. So there was a lot of, I'm not sure if it's sadness, but there was a feeling that things had changed and the relationship would become slightly broken. In Sweden, the attitude was more positive, and Sweden really saw themselves as having a role to play in terms of putting particular issues on the agenda. So they talked about having a voice and being able to champion certain issues such as the environment, climate change, welfare issues, etc. And in Germany, as we saw, people in those focus groups, obviously they saw their role within the EU as very important and strong, but there was a lot of talk about the role in which Germany is a moneylender and is felt to be supporting other European countries. So we asked our respondents how they felt generally about membership in the EU, and it was interesting. There were similarities with our respondents in our UK focus group and also our group in France. Obviously, as Joe's mentioned, the rise of Ukip and the sustained rise of Ukip was very much on our participants' minds, and immigration was such a big issue and very divisive in the focus group, dividing opinion. But whether it was divisive or not, the key thing was that everyone in the group was talking about it. Europe was very much on the agenda for them. But what came out perhaps even more strongly, and again this touches on some of the points mentioned, is that our respondents felt rather negative about the EU, that Britain had lost its way in Europe, and they wanted to be part of it potentially, but they didn't know how and what the role was, and what the role of Europe was in the world anymore. So the quote there was a summary of what participants were discussing. The problem is I don't feel informed enough about our role in Europe and our input. So it wasn't necessarily that they wanted to leave, it was more a lack of information and understanding the direction that the EU is taking. They were much more open to reform than leaving in the main. In France, the general picture was clouded by the French economy and what was going on in France, and they were taking a very much internally focused view and feeling that perhaps without the EU, the French economy would be worse, but they were very much focusing on internal issues. In Germany and Sweden, there was much more of a stronger place in the EU, even though we had a mix of views. Even in Germany, but it's possibly the most positive, they felt that their role in the EU was strong, influential, but they did keep coming back to criticising the money lender aspect that they felt that Germany had been forced to adopt. And in Sweden, interestingly, they were, in Sweden, the views were much more positive, and they felt much more like to focus on the fact the EU is giving Sweden a more prominent voice. The quote there saying, there aren't very many of us in Sweden, so it gives us a bigger role, and actually saying that it gives them a chance to make their voice heard on a number of different issues. So, in looking forward to the EU elections, in the UK, love or loathe, the high media interest in the European elections and in Ukip means that our respondents were talking very much about the elections, and actually, interestingly, everyone in the focus group was saying that they felt committed to voting, which is obviously a change from previous elections where turnout is usually low. But there was a sense that there was a responsibility to vote and to make your stand in terms of whether you agreed or disagreed with the agenda. And also people feeling that it wasn't so much about voting for MEPs in Europe, actually having your say about the issues facing Britain. So having your say about whether you supported UKIP or not, the referendum debate, and also shaping, having a chance to voice how you feel coming up to the general election next year. But in the rest of Europe, in the focus groups we conducted in the other countries, the sense was the election was very much in the background, it wasn't so prominent, and people weren't focusing on it as much. In France, there was a mixed interest, and some participants regretted the lack of information they felt. They felt there wasn't enough media coverage, and the debates on TV and radio were quite sterile. They felt there was a lack of information. They didn't really feel that it was clear what was going to happen after the election. This whole sort of lack of a sense of direction came out quite strongly. In Sweden, the feedback was certainly business as usual. There's obviously elections going on in Sweden as well, and in Sweden they felt that it's a duty to vote, but limited interest in the European parliamentary elections. Although they did focus on the smaller parties that will have a bigger impact this year on single issue topics. And also in Germany, there was again a sense that no special topic and no party was dominating this year in terms of the election, and the influence of voters was singled out as being low, so lack of interest there. So what was the verdict on all of this from each of our countries? Well, in France, our moderating team sort of concluded here that participants showed an interest in the European elections when prompted, but they didn't feel informed, and they criticised the media about this. Most people, when prompted, did know who they would vote for, but they felt that there was a general lack of interest and excitement in the up-and-coming elections. In Sweden, again, as I just mentioned, it's a big election this year with the national elections, and therefore, for them, there was less interest in the European parliamentary elections, and also voters being confused in terms of who to vote for. In Germany, again, the feedback was that they weren't very interested in the elections, and it means they will perhaps rely on previous voting habits or try and collect information in the next week leading up to that. And in Britain, overall, we found that whilst people were very motivated, it was serious business to vote this year, most of them weren't actually focusing on the issues of Europe themselves. They were focusing on, they were certainly focusing on broader issues going on in the country, and they certainly seem to be reluctant to leave Europe behind. So overall, from running the focus groups, we found across the market, so there were certainly divergent opinions, and even within groups, there wasn't a single view. People were clearly very divided on this topic. But the overarching themes that came out in all markets were that our participants felt uncertain about the future in the EU. That doesn't mean to say they felt necessarily negative. Many, when pushed, felt that the EU played a valuable role, but they were just unclear about where it was going, how it was changing and adapting, and how it was fitting into the global picture.